Women of 1812 did not have an easy life. Many of them had various ranks or stations in life. And here in Sault Ste. Marie and Fort St. Joseph was the front line during the War of 1812. It was where the action was. So a lot of the soldiers and military men that came from Europe and traveled to the front lines could not bring their entire families. They were living at the fort or they were living in canvas. And any of the men that were on the front line would live in a very small tent. So if you were the wife of one of the soldiers back in Europe, you would have to apply to a lottery, and only 1 in 6 women were allowed to attend to the soldiers at the fort. So those women had it really tough. They would take care of the laundry, they would take care of the fort, they did all of the cleaning and the cooking and all those sorts of things that women would do at the time. And they would not only have to take care of their husband, but they would be taking care of some of the other soldiers. That's a lot of wool to wash and a lot of things to mend. They would also not have a whole lot to eat. So the soldier whose wife came, he would have to share his rations with the women or with his wife at the fort. And if he had any children with him as well, his rations would have to be shared amongst the family. Now, what if the soldier got shot? So if the soldier was shot, his wife would only have 2 to 3 days to find a husband before she starves. So that's a pretty tough time. Now, if you're a woman that was a higher rank, so someone living or running the Ermitanger Clerg Old Stone House, Charlotte, she would actually have a team of cooks, maids, gardeners, those sorts of things. That house, or the Old Stone House, was built in 1812 to 1814 during the war. So she would have a lot of responsibility in ensuring that everyone was fed, that food was preserved, things were taken care of. She was a higher ranking woman, so she wouldn't necessarily have such a hardship. Now, she would also have much nicer clothing and more responsibilities, taking care of children and taking care of her husband. Her life was a little bit easier. Now, if you were a higher ranking woman in camp, say you were an officer's wife or a captain's wife, you would have the choice to either stay back at the city, stay back with your family, or you could accompany your husband to the camps. And you would live in a tent similar to this. So a little bit classier, nicer than a wedge tent. And therefore you could also tend to your husband's needs, mending, cleaning, cooking, those sorts of things. So those were some of the positions that the women of 1812 had. And a lot of the women did not have it easy. So women during the time of 1812 had various levels of skills and education. Most women would at least know some basic writing skills in order to communicate with their families. But for the most part, they were illiterate, where they could not read and they could not write. So little things to have a little notebook or to keep a journal was something that didn't happen or was not done by many women during the War of 1812. So if you have a journal, or when you do some research on the women of 1812, sometimes you can find some of the journal entries about their life. So you could have been married off by the time you were 14 years old. That means you could be having children by the time you're 14 or 15 years old. And before you were married, you often wanted to show off your skills. So if you could read or write, that was a valuable tool to have, and keeping journals and tracking what life was like. Another large part about showing off your skills would be if you had a pocket that would go on the outside of your dress, you would want to make sure that you could embroider it. Therefore, men could see how talented a sewer or a stitcher you were. Or if you had a little piece of clothing, you could put fine little details on it like this, where you have a little bit of embroidery, and that could show those skills off. Now, if you were a single girl, you would often have your pocket and wear it outside, and this would show that you were available. The married women kept their pockets inside their dresses to keep the money close, because often the men could not be trusted in taking care of the finances. So that was one of the things that women would take care of, as well as mending and taking care of clothing. And many of their articles of clothing, they made everything by hand. So you can imagine a dress of this size and all these different seams, all the stitching that they would have to be doing. So you were never busy. As a woman, you were never sitting still, and if you were sitting, you were often sewing. So women of 1812 were very talented in taking care of their clothing and the household. Okay, everyone, let's talk fashion. For the time in 1812, many of the women actually wore up to about 7 layers of clothing. So often it was about maintaining your modesty. You didn't want to be dark and tanned. You wanted to be lily white, where your skin was as pale as possible. It meant that you weren't working in the field. So often higher class women would be much paler. They would make sure that they were not out in the sun. So it always started with, of course, you wanted to stay warm, so it would often start with a few outer layers. So this is a short cape. The capes would often be a wool fabric, which held up quite nicely. Wool is, of course, as you know, from little lambs, and wool has something in it called lanolin. So that lanolin is actually like a waterproofing or a water repellent, and it's in those fabrics. And if you got rained on, it would often just roll off. Wool was also great for wicking away moisture, as well as keeping you a little bit warm and dry or cool, and could breathe on a really hot day. So this is a short cape, very fashionable of the times. Of course, we didn't have zippers or anything like that today. And of course, we didn't walk around half naked like you do today. So this was one of your outer layers. Of course, it's got buttons in case I wanted to remove any of the hoods. The next layer, you would be wearing a spencer. So this is a long sleeve that was often tapered with a little bit of style to it. And it could be made of a cotton or a heavier, almost like our upholstery fabrics of today. And of course you had buttons, and you would have it done right up to the top. And this would be something that you would wear to town if you were going shopping or going out to a ladies' tea or something like that. So that's your spencer. And of course, underneath you would have your dress. And the dresses were made of a cotton, all hand stitched. So you would do all of the sewing yourself. Now this dress is a modified version of a bib front dress. Many of the dresses have different pieces or styles to them. Most of them would be long sleeve. This one is more of a modified version for today for the warmer weather. And of course, I'm not going to take my dress off, but underneath my dress, I would be wearing a couple of other articles of clothing. So one of them would be, if I didn't have the, or I would have this even if I did have a spencer, this would be underneath. This is a fichu. So this would have been worn, it would be tucked in under your dress. And this was designed to help provide cover and support. And this would actually be tucked right up underneath, inside the dress. So that's your fichu. The next one would be a short stay or a long stay. These have different types of bones in them. And this was sort of like the early style bra. So this would be worn underneath. It would provide the flat support. Most of the women of 1812 would want to have a flatter front appearance. So that's your short stay. The longer stay would just be a longer piece that would go further down, and the longer piece would help keep your dress out and keep you from tripping over it. Another way to cover up your chest would be using one of these little chemisettes. It's a cute little thing that would be tucked in, and of course a sign of wealth would be the lacing that you see on the clothing, and this would be tied up and all tucked into your dress as well. So you had a couple of choices. As the evening progressed, often women would lose the coverage on the top area, and the dresses would become much lower design and even more sheer. But that was the style of 1812. Now, some of your clothing pieces were functional, not just fashionable. This hat, for example, wide brim, keep the sun off my face. We would often make them very pretty using different ribbons and bows. But one of the most important pieces was your mop cap. So the little caps that were worn were actually worn for a reason. During the time of 1812, you didn't bath every day or shower every day. You would actually take a bath about once or twice a year, or if you're really lucky, you'd get to do it once a month. And that was what was referred to as your Sunday best. So on your Sunday best, you would go out, you'd have your bath that day, you'd go to church, and you'd wear your nicest article of clothing, because you may only have 2 or 3 dresses. You'd have your everyday clothing, and then you had your really fancy, really nice dress, or your Sunday best, which would be a little bit fancier, maybe have a little more lace on the trimming, and a little more trim. So that would be my Sunday best dress, and this would be my everyday working dress. But the mop cap, you always wore this because it would help as your hair got greasier, not so clean, and you're coming up to your bath day. It would help to keep the leaves and twigs and things from sticking to your hair throughout the week. And also, you just always wore that. Underneath the dress, everybody had what was called a chemise. So it's a longer white article of clothing that was underneath, and it was like your night dress, and this never came off. You wore it all the time. The soldiers, of course, had their wool uniforms, and they had a white shirt underneath that was actually split down the side, and they didn't have pantaloons or bloomers like women would have, but the shirt was designed that it could tuck right up underneath and act as the modern day underwear during 1812. So there's a little bit of fashion sense and a little bit of talk about the things that we would have worn during those times. Thanks.